They say good fences make good neighbors. But what happens when the person living next door isn't quite human? When the thin walls separating your home from theirs become the only thing standing between you and something that should never have been born. These are 3 true stories about neighbors that will make you question everyone living on your street. And I promise you, after tonight, you'll never look at your own neighbors the same way again. Welcome back to Horror Shadows. I'm your host, and today we're diving deep into the darkness that can lurk just beyond your property line. These stories were submitted by viewers like you, real people, real experiences. Names have been changed for privacy, but the terror, that remains untouched. Let's begin. This first story comes from Sarah, a 28-year-old teacher who moved into what she thought was the perfect starter home in suburban Ohio. It was quiet, safe, and affordable. But perfection, as Sarah would learn, often comes with a price. Sarah had lived in her small ranch home for about 3 months when she first noticed him. Her neighbor, an elderly man in his 70s who lived alone in the house directly across the street. At first, it seemed innocent enough. He was often in his front yard, tending to his garden or sitting on his porch. Normal neighbor activities. But then Sarah began to notice something off. Every morning when she left for work at 7:30 a.m., he was there, standing perfectly still in his front window, watching. When she returned home at 4:15 p.m., there he was again. Same window, same position, same vacant stare directed right at her house. Sarah tried to convince herself it was coincidence. Maybe he was just a lonely old man with nothing better to do. She even waved at him a few times, trying to be friendly. He never waved back. He never moved. He just watched. Weeks passed and the watching intensified. Sarah began to notice him at odd hours. She'd wake up at 2 a.m. to get water, and there he'd be, a dark silhouette against his window, motionless in the darkness. She'd come home from late dinner with friends at 10 p.m., and those cold eyes would be there, tracking her every movement as she walked from her car to her front door. Then one night, Sarah discovered something that made her blood run cold. She was having trouble sleeping, tossing and turning around 3 a.m. when she decided to peek through her bedroom curtains. Her bedroom faced the street, giving her a perfect view of his house. The old man was there, as always, but this time, he was holding something. Sarah squinted, trying to make out what it was in the dim streetlight. It looked like binoculars, high-powered ones, and they were pointed directly at her bedroom window. Sarah's heart began racing. How long had he been watching her with those? What had he seen? She quickly closed her curtains and backed away from the window, but she could feel those eyes on her, even through the fabric. The next day, Sarah decided to do some investigating. She casually asked her mailman about the old man across the street. The mailman's expression immediately darkened. "Oh, you mean Harold," he said, glancing nervously at the house. "Been delivering mail here for 15 years, and that man, there's something not right about him. The previous owners of your place, the Johnsons, they moved out real sudden-like. Middle of the night, actually. Left half their stuff behind." Sarah pressed for more details. The mailman reluctantly continued. "Mrs. Johnson came to me crying one day. Said Harold had been taking pictures of their teenage daughter through her bedroom window. They called the police, but, well, Harold's got connections in this town. Been here since the 1960s. Case got dropped. 2 weeks later, the Johnsons were gone." That evening, Sarah made sure all her curtains were tightly closed. But around midnight, she heard something that made her skin crawl, the unmistakable sound of footsteps in her backyard. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling her house. She called the police, but by the time they arrived, there was no one there. The officers found something, though. Fresh footprints in the soft soil beneath every window of Sarah's house. Large, deep impressions that suggested someone had been standing there for quite some time. The next morning, Harold was back in his window, watching. But this time, when Sarah looked at him, he raised his hand and slowly waved. His face was twisted into what might have been a smile, but from that distance, it looked more like a grimace. Sarah moved out that weekend. She later learned from a friend in the police department that Harold's house had been searched twice over the years. They'd found boxes of photographs, hundreds of them, of various women and children who had lived across the street over the decades, all taken with a telephoto lens, all taken without permission. Harold still lives in that house, still watches, still waits. And sometimes, late at night, neighbors report seeing a dark figure walking slowly around the houses across the street, always carrying something that glints in the moonlight. Voyeurism from neighbors is disturbing enough, but what happens when your neighbor's behavior goes beyond watching and enters the realm of the impossible? This next story from Marcus in Portland, Oregon will challenge everything you think you know about the people living next door. Marcus lived in a duplex, one of those older buildings where the walls are thin and you can hear everything your neighbor does. Usually this would be annoying, but Marcus's neighbor seemed ideal. Quiet, clean, kept to himself. Marcus had only seen him a few times in the 6 months since moving in. A pale, thin man, probably in his 40s, who always wore dark clothing and never made eye contact. The first sign something was wrong came on a Tuesday evening in November. Marcus was watching TV around 8 p.m. when he heard it. Footsteps from next door. But not regular footsteps. These were wrong, too heavy, too slow, and they seemed to be moving in a pattern. Step, 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 pause, step, 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 pause. Always the same rhythm, always the same weight. It went on for hours until well past midnight. When Marcus finally fell asleep from exhaustion, he could still hear them. The next night, it happened again. Same time, same rhythm, same impossible heaviness. Marcus began timing it. The footsteps would start at exactly 8:07 p.m. and continue until 3:33 a.m. every single night, never varying by even a minute. But here's where it gets strange. Marcus worked from home, so he was there during the day. His neighbor's car never left the driveway. The man never seemed to go to work, never had visitors, never ordered food delivery. Yet somehow, during the day, the house next door was completely silent. Marcus became obsessed with figuring out what his neighbor was doing during those nightly marathons. He pressed his ear to the shared wall, trying to understand the pattern. That's when he realized something that made his stomach turn. The footsteps weren't moving around the house randomly. They were tracing the exact layout of Marcus's side of the duplex. The steps would start in what would be Marcus's living room, move to his kitchen, down his hallway, into his bedroom, then his bathroom, then back to the living room. Marcus tried talking to his landlord about it, but the landlord seemed confused. "Neighbor," he said. "Son, that unit has been empty for 2 years. I've been trying to rent it, but..." He trailed off, looking uncomfortable. "Well, people say it's got bad energy. Last tenant, a young woman named Lisa, she disappeared. Police never found her. Left all her stuff, car in the driveway, purse on the kitchen table." That night, Marcus decided to investigate. At exactly 8:07 p.m., when the footsteps began, he went outside and walked around to the other side of the duplex. The windows were all dark, no light, no sign of life. But the footsteps continued, clearly audible even from outside. He walked around to the back door and, finding it unlocked, slowly pushed it open. The smell hit him first. Stale air, like a place that had been closed up for years. The footsteps were much louder now, coming from directly above him. But as Marcus's eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw something impossible. The house was completely empty. No furniture, no carpet, nothing, just bare floors and walls. But the footsteps continued overhead, heavy and rhythmic. Marcus ran. He packed his things that night and moved out the next morning, forfeiting his deposit. He later learned from a neighbor down the street that strange things had been happening in that duplex for years. Tenants would move into Marcus's side, live there for a few months, then suddenly disappear or flee in the middle of the night. The footsteps, they said, had been going on since Lisa vanished. Always the same pattern, always the same time, always in the empty half of the building. Like someone or something was trapped there, endlessly retracing the steps of the living, trying to understand what it meant to be human. Marcus never found out who or what was making those sounds. He doesn't want to know. But sometimes, late at night in his new apartment, he still hears them in his dreams. Step, 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 pause, and wakes up in a cold sweat, wondering if whatever was in that duplex followed him to his new home. Unexplained phenomena from neighbors is terrifying enough, But our final story tonight takes us into territory that crosses the line from supernatural into something far more human and far more sinister. This story from Jennifer in rural Montana will show you that sometimes the most disturbing neighbors are the ones who seem the most normal. Jennifer and her husband Tom moved to a small ranch house in Montana, seeking peace and quiet after years of city living. Their nearest neighbors were about a quarter-mile away, a large family with several children who seemed friendly enough, the Hendersons. They'd wave from their porch, their kids would play in their large backyard, and everything seemed picture-perfect. For the first few months, the Hendersons were model neighbors. They'd bring over fresh-baked cookies, help with yard work, and their children were polite and well-behaved. Jennifer often commented to Tom how lucky they were to have found such a wholesome neighborhood. But gradually, Jennifer began noticing small things that didn't quite add up. The Henderson children never seemed to go to school. Jennifer worked from home and was outside frequently, but she never saw a school bus, never saw the kids leaving in the morning or returning in the afternoon. When she mentioned this to Mrs. Henderson, the woman just smiled and said they homeschooled. Fair enough. But then Jennifer realized she never saw the children playing with toys, never heard them laughing or making the normal sounds of childhood play. The backyard was large and open, perfect for kids, but they just stood around, often in groups, perfectly still, staring in the direction of Jennifer's house. One evening, Jennifer was gardening when she heard something odd coming from the Henderson property. It sounded like chanting. She looked up and saw all 6 Henderson children standing in a perfect circle in their backyard. They were holding hands and speaking in unison, but Jennifer couldn't make out the words. Mrs. Henderson appeared on the porch and clapped her hands twice. The children immediately stopped chanting and filed into the house in a single line, oldest to youngest, without saying a word. "Kids and their games!" Mrs. Henderson called over to Jennifer, that same bright smile on her face. But her eyes... Jennifer noticed for the first time that Mrs. Henderson's eyes never seemed to blink. Things escalated quickly after that. Jennifer began finding dead animals in her yard. Rabbits, birds, even her neighbor's cat, all arranged in neat rows, all facing her house. When she asked the Hendersons about it, they seemed genuinely concerned and offered to help clean up. But that night, Jennifer couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., she heard voices outside. She peered through her bedroom window and saw the entire Henderson family standing in her front yard. All 8 of them, parents and 6 children, arranged in a circle around something Jennifer couldn't see. They were chanting again, the same rhythmic words she'd heard before, but now she could make out some of the phrases. Blood of the willing, flesh of the chosen, come to us in darkness, come to us in shadow. Jennifer tried to wake Tom, but he seemed unusually deeply asleep. She couldn't rouse him no matter how hard she tried. Panicking, she called 911, but when the police arrived 30 minutes later, the Hendersons were gone and Tom woke up immediately, claiming he felt fine. The police found something troubling, though, a circle of salt around Jennifer's house, with strange symbols carved into the ground at regular intervals. The officer taking the report went pale when he saw them. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I think you need to leave. Tonight. These symbols, I've seen them before at a crime scene about 10 years ago. Whole family disappeared from a house about 50 miles from here, left behind the same markings." Jennifer and Tom packed their essentials and drove to a motel in town. The next morning, they returned with the police to collect their belongings. The Henderson house was empty, completely empty. Not just vacant, it looked like it had been abandoned for years. Peeling paint, broken windows, tall weeds in the yard. The police ran the address. According to county records, no one had lived in that house for over a decade. The last residents were the Henderson family. All 8 members had disappeared without a trace in 2012 after neighbors reported strange nocturnal activities. But here's the part that still haunts Jennifer. When they searched her house for any remaining signs of the salt circle, they found something in her basement, something that hadn't been there before. Carved deep into the concrete foundation, In letters 3 feet tall, was a message, "We choose you." Below it, scratched into the floor, were the names of every family that had lived in Jennifer's house over the past 30 years. And next to each name, a date. The date they had disappeared. Jennifer and Tom never went back to that house. They learned later that 17 families had lived there since 1952. All had disappeared without a trace. All had reported friendly neighbors named Henderson, who lived in the house that county records showed had been empty for decades. The house still stands. The county can't sell it, can't tear it down due to some legal loophole involving the missing family's estates. But sometimes, locals report seeing lights in both houses, Jennifer's old place and the Henderson house that shouldn't exist. And sometimes when the moon is dark, they say you can hear children chanting in languages that were old when the world was young, calling out to whoever might be foolish enough to move in next door. These 3 stories remind us that the people we live closest to might be hiding secrets darker than we could ever imagine. The elderly voyeur whose obsession spans decades, the impossible neighbor whose very existence defies explanation, and the family that doesn't exist, yet somehow continues to choose new victims. Your neighbors might seem normal, might even seem friendly, but tonight, when you're lying in bed, listen carefully. Are those normal sounds coming from next door, or is something else living just beyond your walls, watching, waiting, choosing? If you have your own disturbing neighbor encounters, share them in the comments below. I read every single one, and your story might be featured in a future episode. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell. You never know when the next tale of terror might arrive. Sleep tight, and maybe invest in some thicker curtains.